Jesus Christ who is Lord. Now we baptize you. Jesus.
From a tiny Baptist sect to one of Europe's largest religious communities, the Jesus Army grew in wealth, membership and zeal. But behind its colourful brand of militant evangelism, there were darker forces at work in the church's communal houses across central England. We've heard allegations that children were abused on a prolific scale in a variety of ways and by apparently dozens of individuals.
He would be very tactile, and that was ruse for touching me and other girls.
Rose's family joined the church in the 1980s when she was a baby. Aged 12, she was separated from her parents and says she began to be groomed by an elder. We've changed her name and her words are spoken by an actor.
At the time, I didn't know what was going on. I hadn't thought or talked about my body, and he used that to molest me and continued to do it every weekend.
Then in her early teens, she says she was targeted again by another prominent figure in the church.
He said, "Come around here to a deserted place at the back of a building." I had no idea what his intent was, but he proceeded to sexually assault me. I knew something had happened that was wrong and felt a lot of shame. Afterwards, he said I was to blame for leading him astray.
The BBC has spoken exclusively to more than 20 former community children. Each of them claims to have experienced abuse, including the brutal, sexualised beating of boys by groups of men and the intense psychological control of young women.
How the survivors group have come together.
Some of them have received post-cult recovery counselling from Gilly Jenkinson.
Very vulnerable people were recruited into the Jesus Army, and so they were put first, and the children weren't protected. And so the combination of being in a highly, totally controlling environment and then being exposed to sexual abuse is way more than perhaps people have really taken on board.
And the Jesus Army created a sort of environment that abusers could exploit, essentially, if they wanted to. Is that
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've heard some people questioning, really, was there something more sinister going on in terms of a group of paedophiles going, well, hey, here's the sweet shop. It's a bit like putting the fox in the chicken coop, literally. You've got all the chickens, stick the foxes in, and havoc's been caused, absolute havoc.
The remote village of Bugbrook here in Northamptonshire is the birthplace of the Jesus Fellowship. In fact, some of the leaders referred to it as their Jerusalem. And this secluded mansion is where community life first began. It was the first of dozens of properties acquired by the church to house hundreds of members in close quarters under a strict regime of work and worship. Community members gave their income to a common purse, and everything in the houses was shared, from underwear to parenting. Children were brought up strictly and could be disciplined by any adult. Philippa Muller moved into the hall here when she was 5. Now, as part of the Jesus Fellowship Survivors Association, she's seeking damages for as many as 1,000 alleged victims.
The Christian side to it was really a cover for a cult, and unfortunately, brainwashing did occur. We weren't allowed to socialise with other children. We didn't have televisions, we didn't have newspapers. Often things were censored even out of the newspapers. You only really knew what was going on in your own environment. You didn't really question it, and if you did question, you were shut down.
And will you say, God, here are my many, many, many sins, but God...
At the top of the church, one man pulled the strings, the late founder and former businessman Noel Stanton. Seen here in the late 80s, he was a firebrand who preached daily about sins of the flesh.
But now we give our genitals to Jesus.
After his death, the Jesus Fellowship gathered sexual abuse allegations against Stanton and passed them to the police, the result of a disclosure exercise initiated by the church in 2013.
Jesus, loved by the Father, loved by Jesus the Son,
Now we can reveal that 43 individuals who were active in the church have been linked to reports of historic sexual and physical abuse. Around 10 people have already been convicted, including these 2 men, now in their 50s, for indecent assaults on boys.
Meetings went on for hours, 4 or 5 hours sometimes, twice on Sundays. And you've got people manifesting demons and there's people screaming. Such a scary place to be.
Ben, that's not his real name, was born into the church and brought up within its strict practices. He says he was abused and violated by an adult in the grounds of a community house when he was 6 years old.
We ended up on our own for some reason and he molested me. It's something that I've tried to block out for the last 30 years. I withdrew into myself as a child and had no friends my own age.
Ben says one of his siblings was also seriously abused, raped repeatedly as a teenager, while another was attacked by a now convicted sex offender.
I believe that at least 5 of us have been abused in one way or another. I have anger for the church. I have anger because of what they've done to my family.
In recent years, the Jesus Army, under the current leader Steve Mosley, has moved to separate the church from its troubled past.
Right now, we're going to be talking about justice, because justice is a massive issue.
But to no end. In May, it announced plans to close, facing a renewed inquiry by Northamptonshire Police into historic abuse allegations. Detectives will also examine claims of a cover-up by 5 former senior leaders. The Survivors Association has raised concerns about the level of compensation being proposed by the church. It's preparing group legal action involving hundreds of claimants. However, a spokesman for the Jesus Fellowship insisted it was committed to provide money and counselling to those who had suffered poor treatment in the past. It said a formal redress scheme had been set up with external stakeholders to ensure everyone was dealt with in a transparent and even-handed way. Now on the brink of closure, the Jesus Army is understood to have accrued assets worth £50 million, but it leaves a harrowing legacy and an unsettled future for its many victims.